Hello, my name is Chertahlin, and I will be your host for today, the day 5 of the Liberate Data Week Hackathon on the topic of fair data economy. So today is the Fair Data Economy Day. I'm a little bit under the weather, so if I appear a bit not too enthusiastic, it's not because the topic would not be so. This is a very exciting topic, and today we will have presentations about first by me about the fair data economy, a short talk, and then about Fairdrive as a personal consent directory, which will be followed by MeetHub presenting a demo of their app called the demo called Bright Future for Self-Sovereign Identity, followed by introduction to common endpoints for personal data by Salman, and later on a workshop about the conceptions of the Fair Data Society principles and data commons by trilateral research. So this will take place until around 5 p.m. Central European time. And after that, there will be time for some questions for everyone. So what I would like to first stress is that, so welcome to everyone, to all the participants and also the panelists. So if you want to participate, you can either ask a question in the chat or raise your hand to be given a voice by the moderator. So if you want to ask a question. And another thing that I would like to stress is that tomorrow on Saturday, there is also a program planned. So Saturday is the open day when the program is actually set up ad hoc according to the interest from the week, and we already have quite a lot of interest. So the program will be starting at a little bit earlier, so at 14:30 Central European time, and will probably take place all the way up to around 6 p.m. Central European time. So take note of that. The exact program will follow for you to see. So first, let me say something about fair data economy. So it is, of course, a very complex topic, but maybe to simplify it in a few words. So fair data economy is data economy done in a fair way, following fair data society principles. So the principles you have all probably already seen. We have them published on a web page. I will share all the links later on in the chat. And this Fairdrive project that we developed is meant to be the sandbox for fair data economy, like the fulcrum point for projects to come together and develop around data. And of course, the idea is that in Fairdrive, the individual would have all his or her, all their data stored. So there would be one access point to all these individuals' data. And different apps would use it. And different storages could also be linked to this Fairdrive. So for this to be achieved, interoperability is crucial. Also for an economy to interoperability is crucial, also for an economy to emerge. And there are initiatives on many levels tackling these problems. Let me mention just a few of them that we know better or even cooperate with. So one of them is the My Data NGO, which is all about people being at the center of control over their personal data. So how to enable that on different levels. One of our presenters later on, so Salman, is also part of this My Data initiative, tackling a specific problem, which we will describe in more detail. Then there is perhaps an example of these things being done at a national level is the Finnish Sitra, which is like a fund that pushes interesting projects, and they have the fair data economy in their sights as the future. And another initiative interesting in our discussions is the European Data Spaces Initiative, which is a European level initiative, part of the European data strategy. So to establish these sort of verticals within which data can be freely shared, can freely flow, like labor and capital can flow inside the European Union. So for example, could data be shared and exchanged within, like, let's say, a health vertical or a mobility vertical, as they call them. We see Swarm as one of the enablers of a fairer data economy. I will just stress a couple of points here. One is that with Swarm, you avoid siloed data, so no more siloed data, and you gain data sovereignty on the level of people as well as nations. So this storage is under your own control, right? So for more details about this, so how we see Swarm contributing to the data economy, you could also take a look at this Swarm Enterprise Hub. I will share a link later. There's some so topics that are handled there are about data economy, privacy, and regulation aspects. And now I will spend a few minutes talking about the idea of Fairdrive as a personal consent directory. So for a transparent and fair data economy, personal data sharing has to be based on consent. So this is the standard in large part of this is the standard in the European Union, becoming also standard elsewhere. So these kind of movements are at least in the US, India, and probably elsewhere. But I think maybe EU is here leading the field. And a way to formalize this consent relationship could be with a consent receipt. You can imagine a consent receipt being like a receipt you get in a grocery store for the groceries you purchase. But on this consent receipt, you get the info of what data you shared with whom, for what purpose, and so on. So all the fields that maybe are required by GDPR. And sorry if I'm a bit more European-centric. I know that the listeners might be from elsewhere, but hopefully you are familiar with some of these terms. Some GDPR is a regulation in Europe about how personal data should be handled. And although this receipt is not required, it is highly practical for the reasons I'll go into in the following. And also know that a consent is not the only basis for usage of data. So other legal bases could be used. So consent receipt could be perhaps expanded with a more general data receipt. So for each data that is used, even if it's based on some law, you could get a data receipt into this one. Imagine having one folder in your Fairdrive where all these consent receipts and data receipts are gathered. And you can always just click into that folder and look at which consents you have given, who has your data, and so on. So a lot of transparency is achieved this way. But you also have the options of, if somebody builds the right tools right on top of this data in your folder, to act on the consent. So you could maybe revoke consents or ask for the data that you know somebody has about you to be exported to you. So this data portability right, and so on. But also just seeing where this data is, who has what kind of data about you. Maybe you can plan around this and enable different services to connect to that data and use it in ways that you can't even imagine yet now. So this is what is achieved with this transparency. And we think Fairdrive could be a perfect place for this, or like a decentralized storage is a perfect place for that, since it is always accessible and it is a shared single source of truth for all parties. So all parties see the same consent receipts, and consent receipt is basically a JSON file with all this data inside it that is maybe signed by both parties, and that could be rendered on screen in human readable form, right? And so actually a consent receipt suite was built to facilitate the data economy as part of one of the projects that Citra financed. And this consent receipt suite is open source, and it enables you to generate and view Kantara compliant consent receipts. So Kantara is an organization that specified this de facto standard. It's not yet an ISO standard, I believe, but it's in the process. And this consent receipt suite, so it's like meant to be modular, so you can generate view consent receipts with it. You can also store them to Swarm and sign them by both parties, although this part would, if you go and check it out and try to use it, would probably need updating due to the new B release. But in any case, I encourage you, I will share the links later and encourage you to see this. So what I'm trying to stress is, yes, we will support this as part of Fairdrive, and this consent receipt should be the standard way to record any kind of personal data exchange, and they should be all available to the individual, and this could be achieved with a consent directory inside Fairdrive. So as I said, I'll share the links later, but I think we could start already with the first speaker today. Actually, there will be two speakers, so Alexander and Eugene, I think, who will. So Alexander is also one of the. Maybe you can already turn on your camera so that we see that everything is.
Yeah, hi, colleagues.
Hi. So Alexander is also one of the contributors to the enterprise white paper, and so they will demo the application that is about self-sovereignty, about identity. So Alexander, please, I will give you the microphone now.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Hi, colleagues. So I would ask my colleague Eugene to demonstrate the screen. Today I represent, my name is Alexander Parton, and I represent the MeetHub team developing the MeetHub platform. So just a second. Yep. Okay, now I see it. So the MeetHub platform idea is to bring back to the person the control over her personal data. And at the same time, we would give the person the high quality and safe tool to provide temporary access to the personal data for the companies who need it for their purposes. Changing the slide. So basically, MeetHub concept, as I mentioned, to bring back to the person the control of the personal data and their safe processing has become possible due to the development of blockchain technology, smart contracts, cryptography, and decentralized storages. However, for the platform to work on a full scale, we would need a safe and reliable decentralized storage of personal data. That's why we're working with Swarm team so that Swarm becomes such a storage. And in particular, I would mention the DREAM protocol in this context that we are working together with the Swarm team to develop. So second item, we build the platform based on trust and transparency. So the source code of all key platform applications will be open after the public beta and will be subject for the analysis and joint collaboration. At the same time, the user's personal data will not be accessible even to the platform administrators, as we vote for the society where only people control and manage their personal data. I also would like to point out that the platform participants should not only rely on trust, as the smart contracts will guarantee that all processes work as it's declared. And before we start the demo, I would present the main participants of the platform. So basically, first, and which are in the center of the platform, the users. The users will be able to upload, store, and manage their personal data on the platform and provide access to this data to the companies who are interested in processing it. Second, which is actually on the slide, the websites, the third one. So the websites are exactly the companies who need to get access to the personal data to provide the services, to sell the goods, etc. So that the websites can be sure about the correctness of users' personal data uploaded on the platform, we have the validators. And these are specific companies who check that the user's personal data is correct when comparing with the data from the user's official documents. This is done before the data is uploaded to the platform. And also, like the fourth participant, we provide the ability for all others, for our participants to interact with authorities on the platform, for whom we created a special workplace. Under the term authorities, I mean any governmental body. In particular, it could be like data protection authorities supervising GDPR. And as Chert mentioned, talking about GDPR, in our project, we use GDPR as the law in the personal data protection area, which is basically like the most contemporary one and the one which puts the interests of the person in the center, comparing to some other countries where the law may protect the interest of others. So basically, we have also created separate workplaces for other platform participants. And overall, we deeply developed many questions, but within the current demo, we will show only part of our functionality, which is basically 3 scenarios. So I will talk about the user who has just registered on the platform and wants to upload the data from his passport. Second scenario, the user will use the data uploaded to the platform to register on some website, for example, to purchase some goods. And third, if the user decides for some reasons to revoke access to his personal data from the website, we will show how this functionality works on the platform. Okay, so that's all for the intro. Let's come to the demo. And basically, first of all, I want to describe what you can see on the screen. So the user use the platform via the mobile application. And on the right of the screen, you can see the screen of the mobile app that we have. On the left, you can see the workplace of the validator. Validators, websites, authorities, other platform participants have their own workplaces working in the web browser. So in particular, you can now see on the screen that in the mobile app, there is no data yet. So the person has just registered. And I also want to mention, like, the interfaces are work in progress. Definitely, it's like we created them, but it will be reworked in the future. So let's come. Now, I, as a user, wants to register to put some data onto the platform. So basically, I push the button, add document, and goes to the screen. Now I need to choose the country from where I have my citizenship. I will choose the UK. And definitely it's like what kind of document I want to upload to the platform or data from the document. I will choose a passport. As the websites might have different requirements for KYC of the user, we have created on the platform different levels of verification of users' personal data. For example, you can see on the screen like different colors. The yellow level of verification means that the validator checks users' data online. The green one, that the validator does it in person. For the purposes of the demo, I wouldn't describe the screen like in all the details. We will just use the yellow one. So I'm choosing the yellow. Now the user needs to fill the data in. To save time, we pre-fill the application, but in reality, the user will either put data manually or use some kind of a tool solution to scan the data from the passport. And let's change the place of birth, for example. So it's bee swarm, and we will put like beehive. For sure, it's like, since we show the demo on Swarm Hackathon, we decided that the user should be a bee. Let's go to the next screen. I confirm, and now we need to attach the photo of the passport so that the validator can actually compare the data from my application to the photo. And the passport we have, yeah, the passport of the bee. So we make a photo and we attach it. Great. So I put the check that I agree to the consent to the terms of the platform, push the button, and the file is now uploaded. So what happens now? I submitted the application. We see that the platform is looking for the validator. And to describe the validator is chosen randomly. So basically all applications from the user are put in one queue, and the first validator in the queue takes the first application in the line. So now we go to the screen of the validator, and I'm the validator's employee working on the applications. So I push the button to take the first application in the line. It takes some time because we are working on the blockchain and smart contracts. And actually, we use it for the demo purposes. So now we see the first application is coming to the screen. And yeah, fortunately, it's the same application that I just put using the mobile app. Okay, never mind, just a joke, of course. You might see in the mobile app, actually, that now I, as a user, have an active chat with the validator. But I'm currently working as a validator, so let's send some hello to the user. And what would be replied from the B? Of course, it would be like bzz. Now, let's continue. So as a validator, I check the validator's application, the user's application, compare its data with the photo of the passport attached, and see whether the information is correct. I see that definitely it's like there is a mistake with the place of birth. So on the document, it's bee swarm. In the application, we see that it's beehive. So I have an ability as a validator to change. I'm doing it. As soon as I am sure that everything is right, I confirm the application. So in the validator's workplace, actually the verification issued is shown in the respective section. And the validator can also view the statistics of the issued verifications, including by each validator's employee, the remuneration that he gets from the platform for the verifications, and also to change settings and manage access for the validator's employees. So now coming back to user, I see my data verified by the validator. Once again, I check that everything is correct from my perspective, and then push the button confirming that I agree to upload the data on the platform. At this moment, the data is put into Swarm. And at the same time, the fact of verification of my data is recorded in the blockchain. Of course, my data is not recorded on the blockchain, just the fact of its verification by the specific validator. In order to protect confidentiality of the user's personal data uploaded to Swarm, the data is encrypted using IS-256. And as I mentioned in the intro, we are working with Swarm team on the DREAM protocol that will enable anyone to upload the data to Swarm in a way where the owner of the data can manage access to the file in Swarm. You can also, okay, so yeah, I might rate the validator. And going next, we can check that, yeah, on the screen, on the mobile app, we can see that I have now the data. I can go through and look what data I have now uploaded to the platform. You can see the button update. This is basically in case, for example, I, as a user, the B, changed my passport, and respectively, I need to update the data. If I do it, once again, the new data needs to be verified by the validator, and only after that, it is uploaded to the platform. So basically, this is like the first scenario. Let's come to the second one. So in the second scenario, we will provide the data to the website. For example, if I want to register to purchase some goods, and what the website as a B, I want to purchase some flowers, for sure. But first of all, let's see like how the workplace for the website works, for the website employees. So each website, before being able to process the user's personal data with the platform, needs to register on the platform and get access to its workplace. And also just a point, I use the term website just for the demo perspective. Basically, it might be any company who wish to process the personal data of the users. But for the purpose of the demo, I would just name this company as a website. The MeetHub platform is designed based on the GDPR requirements, as I mentioned, including privacy by design and privacy by default. It's also aimed at protecting the user's interests for as maximum as possible in the area of personal data. So the mandatory condition for the website to start processing personal data is drafting the respective privacy notice, which talks about the purposes of processing specific activities, etc. On the platform, we have a specific construction tool helping to create the privacy notices in a flexible way. And the website can create one or several privacy notices. It's not the purpose of the demo to show this construction tool, so I would just show how it works. For the purposes of the demo, we have a pre-filled privacy notice. And as a website employee, I can see how it looks like, for example, from the user's perspective. So basically, now as the user, I would like to register on the website. So let's come back to the website. So I'm a bee, as I mentioned. I need some flowers. First of all, I need to register. So I push the register. I have like the usual I choose MeetHub as a way to register on the platform. So I see the QR code. And now I'm using my mobile app to scan this QR code. In the right up side of the mobile app, I see the specific sign. And I'm using my phone. I put it on the screen. Whoop. So now on the screen in the mobile app, I can see that there is information which personal data is requested by this website. I can see which specific data is requested, what is the ground for the provision of the personal data, whether it's consent, contract, law, legitimate interest, or anything else. If the ground is consent, according to the GDPR, I can choose which data to provide, which not. If it's a contract, I can just check like which data is requested. And of course, this is like just how to say summary of the data. But if I push on the image of the privacy notice, I can read the privacy notice from this website in full. Okay, I think I agree. This is not a big amount of data to provide, and I might agree to provide the place of birth, the date of birth. So okay, I push confirm. As soon as I do it, I can see in my mobile app that now we have a line with the name of the company to which I provided my personal data. If I push on the image of the agreement, I can also check which data exactly I provided to this company. And I can do it, I mean, any day, any minute, just opening my mobile app. Even after the year, if I forgot already which data I provided, I can open the mobile app and check it. Not only can I check it, and also it's like not only can I check the amount of data provided, I can also read once again what was the text of the privacy notice that I consented to. Because, for example, if I believe that my rights are violated in a way, I can just compare my understanding on which conditions the data can be processed with the exact text of the privacy notice. So the fact that I provided access to the website for my personal data is also recorded on the blockchain and is always available for both parties, me and the website, to be read. And also if we come back to the screen of the website, you can see that I successfully registered on the website with just a few clicks in the mobile app. It's done. And also how it's looked from the website employee perspective. I see that as a website, I have several people provided me the personal data. Now it's like in this way, but if I click on one line, I may get access to the personal data if, of course, as an employee, I have a right to do it. I have a warning that all my actions are recorded on the website. It's done to protect the user's data from the leaks. I push consent, and now I can see, yeah, the data of the bee is seen by the website. That's the second scenario. So coming to the third scenario, let's imagine as a bee, for some reasons, I'm not very, how to say, I don't like the way how the website treat my data. And I like the prices for the flowers, so I wish to continue to be the customer of this website, but I decided to revoke the consent for processing the date of my birth. Since I provided it on a consent on the basis of consent, I can do it. Coming to the mobile app, I'm just going to the specific section and choose manage access to the data that is provided on the basis of consent. I'm worried that if I revoke the consent for processing of this data, this might lead to some negative consequences in my relationship with the website. So for example, I don't know, I might not get access to some functions of the website, some additional like bonus, etc. So I choose which data I want to revoke. And basically I click, we have only one line. So I click it and confirm that, yes, I want to revoke this data. I want also to point out that this is, I'm able to revoke this data because it was provided on the basis of consent. If it's provided on the basis of a contract, for example, as a user, I can't unilaterally get this data or like revoke the access, only with the consent of the website as a second party. But now we are talking about the basis of consent, so I revoked it. And let's check first on my side. As a user, we see that the data is not provided. And on the part of the website, let's see how the platform functions. So as a website employee, once again, I click on the user, and we see that I don't see anymore the data for the date of birth. So it's important to point out that, again, the actions of both user and website are fixed in the blockchain, recorded there. And that's why, for example, revoking of consent is also recorded in a blockchain. As to the actual like technical aspects of revoking, this is exactly done using the DREAM protocol, or would be done using the DREAM protocol that we are currently developing together with Swarm team. That's all for the demo. Just a few words in the end of our presentation. So the functionals that we showed is just a part of what we have on the platform. The purpose of the demo is basically to get you acquainted with our project. As I mentioned before, our function also includes interaction with authorities, ability to create drafts of the documents using which the data might be uploaded by the users, the tool helping to draft the privacy notices, remuneration systems, different level of verification, etc. The first version of the platform at the launch will be with a larger functional. And for sure, I want to mention, mention a huge thanks to the Swarm team, to our partners, with whom we continue the active work so that Swarm may become the decentralized storage that providing the user with the ability to store and manage their personal data in a safe and fair way. Thank you to listening for us. Thank you, guys.
Hi, Alexander. Thank you. This was very nice. This was actually the first time I saw your demo, although we have been working together for some time. So I'm quite impressed. You also have some kudos from the audience. So yes, please let the audience ask some questions now.
Yeah, sure. But colleagues, just a moment. I'm the privacy counsel, so I'm a lawyer. And if you ask some technical questions, I will try to answer, but it might take some time for me to answer.
Okay. Did anyone raise a hand? Maybe I have to check this. No, I don't think so. Or just type the question to the. Aha. So Dietmar is asking, can you provide a GitHub repo for this?
We actually haven't yet opened the code. As I mentioned, we will do it on the public beta, during the public beta. So at the moment, we don't have any GitHub repo where you can change it. Definitely we'll do it.
So maybe I have a couple of questions. So do you have a roadmap? So when will this beta be out? And also the other question would be, so why did you choose Swarm for this?
Talking about the roadmap, we are currently developing the one. As soon as it's ready, we will definitely announce it. Talking about Swarm, I would mention that with Swarm, we actually got acquainted back in the end of 2019. And we see Swarm as very much, how to say, we fit each other, talking about the principles, because Swarm is developed based on the user's interests in the center, based on the fair data society principles, etc. And we have the same principles in the center of our platform. So I see it. And also from technical perspective, currently we see that Swarm is the best, which fits the idea of storing personal data. As I mentioned, we need to make some other tools like the Dream protocol, but for us, it's the one and the best decentralized storage who can do it.
Okay, so we have actually some additional questions. So are there any plans to add an expiration date to consent from Heterotech?
Yeah, well, it's like, as I mentioned, the demo is quite short one, just to get acquainted. We have many ideas which we want to include on the platform. Expiration date might be one thing among others. And we want to, it's like we make it, what to say, as much automatic as possible. So for example, if I am as a website gets consent for a year, we want to make it happen using smart contracts that after the year, it is revoked. But as a lawyer, I can also tell that there are some scenarios where the website may need this data even after 1 year. I don't know, for example, if there is an active suit in a court between the website and the user, and the website now has to store the data based on the law perspective. So that's why the answer to the question is yes, we want to do it. The way how we do it, how we develop, we also need to take into account some legal aspects and maybe the interests of different parties.
Thank you. So actually, there's quite a lot of questions. So let me remind the audience that there will also be time to ask questions after all the presentations. So at around 5 o'clock Central European time. So we can try to tackle some more. Actually, I have to scroll up now. There's so much chatter. So maybe these two we could quickly try to answer. Does this use SSI, so self-sovereign identity decentralized identifiers, and what kind of DID auth protocol? And then another one. So do you think this can reduce consent fatigue on the part of the user? I guess maybe applying to the expiration.
Yeah, as answering the first question, definitely we will use DIDs. Unfortunately, it's like I can't answer the second part of the question, what kind of DID auth protocol we are using. As I mentioned, I'm a lawyer, but yes, for sure, it's like DIDs, we will use it. And we also have some ideas connected to it, how to make that, how to use the DIDs without undermining the confidentiality of the user's personal data. I would mention it this way. Not a technical questions. Yes, I believe that it's like definitely consent fatigue on the part of the user. We can reduce it simply by the mobile app, as you can saw in the functional. It's very easy to check, easy to understand. So in full compliance with the GDPR principles.
Okay, thank you. So there's one more question that I would alert you to. So contact details, Dietmar is asking for this. Maybe you can paste them to chat later on.
Yeah.
So thank you, Alexander. We would now move to our next presenter. So Salman, if you can check your camera. Bye-bye, Alexander. Turn on your camera. Hi, Salman.
Hi there.
Hi. So Salman will be talking about common endpoints for personal data storage, in short, SEPs. Salman is one of the very active people in the My Data community, specifically tackling the problem how to enable interoperability when working with several personal data storages. Personal data storages are sort of places where you can store your personal data, and I guess like Fairdrive could be one of them. Or Fairdrive is actually, the plan is to integrate many of these PDSs under Fairdrive, but so he will explain in more detail, but so it's about interoperability, and it's very interesting for us. So to build this society, we need this. So Salman, if you're ready.
Yeah, sure. Let me share my screen. It should be here. And let me get I assume you can see that. And let me just get the PowerPoint going. Perfect. Is that working?
Yes, I can see the PowerPoint.
Perfect. So hello, everyone. Yeah, so as Jared mentioned, I'm here to introduce SEPs, which is common endpoints for personal data, personal servers and data stores. And I'll come back to what that means. But I guess my presentation first has some historical context, especially for the younger people in the audience. So I thought I'd do that using emojis. See, we forget that when the web was first conceived, it was conceived as a network of peers, where all the network nodes are like these smiley emojis. They're all equals, happily communicating with each other. And in fact, the first web browser that was created by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, actually here in Geneva, and by the way, maybe that's why Zahur showed you Geneva yesterday. So the first web browser was actually a browser and editor, so you could create and read web pages. And basically, the web was supposed to be distributed and peer-to-peer before we started using those terms. Of course, that's not exactly how the world has turned out, but I would argue that's sort of the current structure of the internet is kind of like an accident of history. When the web took off in the 90s, it took like millions of dollars to set up a simple web service. So you had companies like Yahoo, which spent those millions of dollars to run their site, and then they had to pay for that infrastructure. So they came up with a simple business model. And that was to show you some ads. Of course, then some other companies realized that if they had a lot of data about you, they could sell their ads for more money. And that proved to be a really powerful business model. And so the main operating model of the web for the past 2 decades became established. Of course, that's a model that many of us think kind of sucks, but I'm saying this because I want to make the point that the web was conceived as being decentralized and that things don't have to be that way. And even without blockchains, the web has a lot of technologies and infrastructure which is decentralized that fits the ideals of everybody, I think, in this hackathon. So for example, as you've mentioned also, in the previous talks, some of us think that it's better if our data was sitting on our personal web servers, like data stores that we fully control. And of course, if developers, like the people in this hackathon, create great applications, where we can and store our data on our data stores, then we would be the kings, right? And in that way, Swarm or Fairdrive can be seen as personal data stores, especially because of the work that the Fair Data Society is doing. You would use web apps or dApps or other apps to store data on these drives. And I'll get back to what these drives could look like a little bit more. But the problem until now is that a lot of these personal data stores, these PDSs, haven't really worked with each other. Each one of them has their own little standards and interfaces and APIs, and they're all kind of isolated on their own sort of largely uninhabited islands. So, and of course, the question is, why would anybody want to build applications for a PDS based on some proprietary interface? So not many people would. And if nobody builds apps then to store your data, then there's no data to store. And so what's the use of having a personal data store? And of course, that's why events like this hackathon are so important. But I guess the argument that I'm trying to make is that these apps would be so much more powerful if they had a larger audience. So as Chert mentioned, there's this wonderful organization called My Data, and their mission is to, and it's a powerful wording, it's to empower individuals by improving their right to self-determination regarding their personal data. And that's something that I would really sign up for. And actually I have done, as Fair Data Society has as well. And we're both members. My Data has these annual conferences. And in the last actual in-person conference they had before COVID, a few of us got together for a drink and we came up with this idea, and we thought, wouldn't it be nice if we have one interface, one API that any application developer could use to communicate with any PDS. So when an app developer creates an app that works for one type of data storage, effectively, it could work with all of the other PDSs. And that would motivate app developers to create more apps. And there'd be a bunch of apps using the same API, then more people will actually find PDSs useful, which would attract more app developers and PDSs and PDS users. And then you can start to imagine a rich ecosystem being developed where each of us has our own server and controls all of our data. So earlier this year, a few of us from within the My Data organization that are PDS enthusiasts agreed on a specification for apps to read and write data to any data store that uses this interface. So we call that SEPs 1.0. And I'll give you an example. So let's say there's a calendar app on www.bestcalendarapp.com, right? So when I sign up for the app, I tell Calendar App that my server, I give them my server address, and that's at salmonff.com, my name. And I tell my server I want to use Calendar App, and that Calendar App can access my data store on my server. And specifically only one data table called com.bestcalendarapp.entries. And then all Calendar App needs to do to create a calendar entry and store it on my data store is to send this post request to my server. And that's it. So instead of my data sitting on a Calendar App server, it's sitting on my server on my data store. And that's the idea of SEPs. And all an app needs to know is my server's URL, and all my server needs to do is to make sure that if an authorized app writes to my server, /step/write/table name, that it stores the entry in the right place. That's it. And ultimately, all applications use 4 or 5 basic commands, the CRUD commands, and you read, write, update, query, and delete data in the data store. So in SEPs, we agreed that if all PDSs use the same paths to allow apps to read and write records, then app providers can write their apps once, and it could work on all PDSs that adopt SEPs. And we also put in a simple authentication mechanism based on OAuth 2, which I'll come back to a little bit later as well. But let me also, as seems to be the case for people as seems to be the case here in this hackathon, let me start with a demo. And this demo is actually, I built this Chrome extension, which is a Chrome extension, which basically has all the functionality that I always wanted to have in a Chrome extension. And it's called ViewLog. And basically, I can, if I'm on a web page, I can use that Chrome extension. I can right click and I can highlight text. And I've got this little shortcut where I can turn on edit mode. And then I get this sort of like ugly but useful like highlighter. And I can, change my colors and highlight whatever I want. And if there's a link that I want to see later, if I go on a link, I can add links to my inbox, right? And I sort of add all these links to my inbox, and it's just a Chrome extension, right? And basically in this Chrome extension, I go to my inbox and I have my, the things that I want to read later. I've got some other things that I always wanted, like it to actually store all your browser history on your data store, and I can remove the cookies on that website places. But all of this functionality is obviously sort of around in a lot of other extensions as well. But the difference here is that basically the ViewLog stores my data, my highlights, my browser history, whatever I want, on my server. In this case, I'm logged into my server, salmonff.com. So ViewLog is sending this data over to my server. And if I sort of go to salmonff.com, which you're going to refresh, this is sort of, it's a demo account, but I see what I just added to my inbox here. And I can also see my browser history. Again, this is a demo account, so you're not going to see all my browser history, but you see what I've just been browsing in the past couple of days. And here, so and I also sort of, if I go back to my home page, this is based on Freezer, which is kind of my conception of what a personal server should look like. It's actually the personal server I've been using for the past few years for myself, which has sort of like a blogging app and actually I have a note-taking app and such things installed on it. And I'm going to divert a little bit from SEPs here because sort of my Freezer, which is my personal data store, is a little bit different from SEPs. It implements SEPs, but I think it'd be useful to sort of see where kind of at least I see this going and where some of us see this going. So I have this demo, second demo on localhost, because this is a little bit on development. But the idea is that, you should be able to go on and sign on to your data store. And the data store, is basically, or the server acts like a key manager. So if you enter your Amazon key, if your data store is on Amazon. But here we should also have Fairdrive, right? And hopefully we will soon, where Fairdrive acts as your data store. But for the moment, we're going to authenticate with Dropbox. So basically, I'm coming onto the server. I'm going to authenticate. I'm going to get this terrible warning and say, so yeah, use my Dropbox as my data store, right? And I also to keep my files, and I also can use my files as a database, right? I can also use Mongo and other things, but I'm going to use my files as a database. And I put, since I've already sort of logged on, I'm going to create an account for Church here. And I'm going to say, okay, create my, launch freezer, basically create my data store. Right. Oh, I'm not sure if the demo gods are with us today. But basically what happens is that if I go to my Dropbox, right, what I should see is that my freezer is created, but I should see, maybe I need to refresh here. So basically, yes, and if I refresh, I see that sort of on my Dropbox, basically, there's been a data store space created for Chert, like assuming my name is Chert, and it's sort of created and already created a database. If I go back to my freezer, there's no my personal server. There's no apps there, obviously. So there's a few ways to define what an app is, and there's a few ways to think about apps. I created this little app for a demo that I made at the same My Data conference that I mentioned. It was in Finland, and this is called IXI because it can store only one note, and it's on GitHub. And I can just say, okay, take this app from GitHub and install it. And basically, if we look at my GitHub, all this app is basically a CSS file, an HTML file, and a JavaScript file. And basically, the point of this app was to create an app in like 30 lines of code. So that's why it's such a simple app. And basically, what this does, if I refresh here again, is that if I, oh, there we go. Well, the demo gods are not with me today, so I got a little bit of an error here. So let's see if it cooperates a little bit better this time. And here you see that basically the app has now been created on my data store. It's this app called org.my.data IXI, and actually, if I go to if I actually used a drive, I can, hold on one second. If I go to my data store, you can see it's also Dropbox re-replicates this basically on my data store on my desktop. And if I go to my users, I can see Chert here, and I can see my apps. Basically, what the app does is that it basically allows me to write one note. So basically, I'm going to say hello Swarm, right? Much like the app yesterday. And basically, this is now this is a demo to say, well, I'm gonna, it wrote to the database, and writing to the database means that if I go here now and I can see that, yeah, actually I have written hello Swarm to my database, right? The other thing that's interesting about this concept, which is also a similar concept to the Fairdrive, is that my apps are also sitting on my data store as well. So basically, if I go to, let's say if I open my this HTML file, which is part of my app, it's here. I can, because it's Chert, we're going to call this ENA note instead of IXI notes, and we're going to save it. So basically what's going on here is that now, my app is updated. So as a developer, I can actually refresh this, and I've updated the app that's sitting on my data store. And the demo gods are again not with us today. Well, they're partly with us maybe. And if I now go to my app on IXI note, basically, I've edited my app. It's called EnaNote now instead of XCNote. So this sort of, in a way, is a demo to sort of, again, emphasize the power of actually controlling your data and your code. Your apps being code are also your data, and you control them. So that's it for my demo. I'm going to go back, and I know I've sort of run a little bit longer because of this demo than I anticipated. I hope that's okay, Chert, but I'll try to sort of finish this off in terms of the presentation, which is basically coming back to this diagram, which is that really you're storing your data. Storing your data on your own data store is very empowering because the data is not stuck on some silo. It's sitting on my server. I'm free to take my data files and move it from Dropbox to Fairdrive or wherever else, and my data is fully autonomous. It has that degree of freedom. And more importantly, I can give other apps access to my data. So if you create a better app, I can get rid of ViewLog and use your app to do my bookmarking and just give that app full access to my ViewLog data tables. Or if you build an app that visualizes all my browser history, then all I need to do is to have both apps and give access to that app. And the point being that you don't have to ask for ViewLog's permission to access your own data. In the world of SEPs, it's the app that needs to ask for your permission to access your PDS. You're in control. And so it's not just that you're liberating data. Your data is autonomous. So it's liberating you and empowering you to use it freely and gain value from it. And actually, all of that can be done with SEPs 1.0. So the next step for SEPs basically is to figure out how to share data among PDSs. And for example, if I want to share like one of the bookmarks with Chert, or if I want to share my location history, how would I do that? And to do this, basically, you would need all of these data stores to authenticate against each other, so that you can share data. And again, because I've run a little over, I will just mention that if you think about the web technologies like OAuth, they're actually even though they're not built for a specifically built for being a centralized application, de facto they are centralized because they force you to actually sort of register yourself manually on the app server, the centralized app server. And without getting into details, what sort of we've created with SEPs 2.0 is basically what we've called kind of like an out-of-band callback mechanism. See, Justin Richer, who created GNAP, which some of you might know, called it that, because basically it allows two different servers to authenticate against each other without having the centralized authority that is dominant, where you have to go register manually. And so with that, basically, you can start sharing with each other. And this is what we would call SEPs 2.0, which we're hoping to finalize. And then we would each be reading and writing from our own servers and data stores, much like the web was originally conceived. So that's it. Thanks for the opportunity to present SEPs to you. And obviously, if you're interested, you can get in touch, preferably via my data.
So thank you, Salman. That was a very dynamic and interesting presentation. So it also shows how much aligned we are with what we want to do, actually. So, first, I would like to remind the audience to please ask questions or raise your hand if you want to ask a question. I think we can spend another 5 minutes on this topic and later on return to it at the Ask Me Anything. We actually will support SEPs. By we, I mean FairData Society, by implementing it with FairOS DFS, and also contribute to the specification. So we imagine that SEPs will be the the language that all the apps will be using when also different storages will be inside Fairdrive, which is also the goal. So. And I also want to remind the audience that, yeah, actually, so we're talking about personal data. You might think this does not apply to you as much, but actually I would say that most of app data, so an app data is probably tied to some particular person, right? So most of app data actually is personal data in that sense. So it falls under that category. Okay, I will check the questions now. So you have from Dietmar a thumbs up, and from, okay, so this is actually not for you. Gregor also, yeah, thank you for the talk. So any questions, maybe hands raised or something? Now is the time. So what I actually wanted to ask you, maybe provoke you a bit. So when will ViewLog be available in Fairdrive? Are you, will this be during this hackathon or?
Well, ViewLog is available for anybody to download. Then it's a question of when can Fairdrive implement SEPs, which will hopefully be soon. So then as soon as SEPs is implemented in Fairdrive, obviously you can just sort of log into your Fairdrive from ViewLog and store all your browsing history and make bookmarks there. So that's
yeah, you're
hopefully it will be soon
to us. Yeah. Okay. So Gregor is, sorry. Greg is asking, could your solution in future be an alternative to centralized biometric databases created by...
Chat, I'm sorry, this is Alexander. I'm just answering some questions on the chat.
Sorry.
So
I thought it was maybe a bit strange, yeah, because I saw it before. Okay, sorry. Yeah, but it also applies to SIP, says Gregor. Okay. Well, then let's try it. Could your solution in the future be an alternative to centralized biometric databases created by state actors and tech titans?
So, you know, my personal, I mean, in theory, yes. I think my personal view around this ecosystem is that, as we've seen here around Swarm as well, there's a number of different efforts. And sort of the presentation we saw last was sort of down the road of sort of the very serious app and taking advantage of the security of and all the sort of a lot of great features around Swarm. I think what SEPs is kind of orienting towards is more kind of the lighter apps. And not saying, hey, our forte is to be able to store like, you know, strong, you know, sort of like your passport and your ID and all this, you know, that kind of sensitive data. But like, it's more about, hey, your ViewLog or your notes and apps that you use every day where you have these interactions are much less formal. So I think our first view is, hey, we don't want to go to the more sort of more serious, I say, apps, but sort of be geared towards more lightweight issues where people start using decentralized storage as kind of the way they interact with each other and their data on a day-to-day basis for little things. And that's just the sort of the lightweight approach that we've taken, and you'll see it in the simplicity of the things that I showed you. It's just, you know, very simple stuff. Can we do the simple stuff here and create really easy, fun apps that, you know, we just use like that?
Yes, that's probably a good way to start something, not to get bogged down in complexity, right? So thank you, Salman. So maybe
it's a final one.
So this is another. Okay. So yeah, I don't think there are any more questions at this moment. So of course, there's the MEA at the end. So thank you, Salman, for your presentation. And I would
thank you very much for letting me present to this audience. That's great.
And I would like to invite Mistal, Adia, and Robin to check their cameras, to turn on their cameras. So the upcoming session by Trilateral Research will include a couple of presentations, followed by a discussion moderated by Robin, and this will also include the audience, so you can ask questions. Maybe you will even be asked questions, I don't know. And it will tackle, so the session will tackle the topics of data commons, EU data protection, public data, EU data spaces, and others. So I guess maybe who do I give the word to? Mistal, you start, or Robin? You...
Yes, yeah, I can go.
Please.
Thank you, Chert.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mistal from Trilateral, and I'll be presenting today with my colleagues Aditya and Robin. And I'm just going to jump right in because we don't have lots of time. And we've specifically set aside some time for questions and a discussion at the end. So I'll start with a presentation about data privacy principles And then Aditya will focus a little bit more on data commons. And then we'll go into our discussion moderated by Robin. Okay. So the basis of this presentation is some research funded by Swarm that will hopefully eventually turn into an article or something. So the whole 3 is called Conceptions of the Fair Data Society Principles and the Data Commons. And within that, I've been looking at this, which I call towards extra/territorially bound data privacy principles setting global norms. So if I just deconstruct that from the bottom up, the global norms that I want to refer to pertain to data privacy or informational privacy or data protection, whatever nomenclature, depending on where you're from. But I'm trying to look at globally shared conceptions of that, of which there isn't a norm at the moment, I argue. And a way to get there is to have local laws or norms or standards or principles extend extraterritorially, so beyond, for instance, the territorial boundaries of the EU. So I'm going to see whether that works and trace the development of data privacy laws in several jurisdictions, plus also globally shared ones, such as these fair data principles that I guess we have come up with, and to see what this says about territory and shared values. So firstly, I'll be looking at the fair information practice principles from the US. And there's a common narrative. Why this is interesting is there's a common narrative that the EU kind of started data protection or had the golden standard. And I think it does, and it certainly did. And most countries' data protection laws originated in the EU. But it's incorrect to say that vis-a-vis the US, the EU was a forerunner because, for instance, they had these fair information practice principles around the same time that European countries were even getting data protection laws. So you had Hesse in Germany, the state getting the first ones in 1970, I believe, and then Sweden in about 1971, and then there was a cascade effect. So from that, so I want to acknowledge the US's role, and then I'll look at EU data protection law. And then moving away from national or supranational jurisdictions, I'll look at the Fair Data Principles, the newly proposed EU Data Governance Act, and then ask whether there's some kind of shared standard. And within each of these substantive topics, I'll mention the territorial or extraterritorial dimension. So the Fair Information Practice Principles, or FIPS, were a product of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the US, which is a consumer protection organization. And it also enables competition, so antitrust law. And in 1973, the Department of Health, Education and Welfare released a report called Records, Computers and the Rights of Citizens. And within that, they outlined these principles that are written on the screen. And these were widely accepted principles about maintaining informational privacy in an electronic marketplace. I use information privacy as a more US term, and then data privacy as a kind of Anglo-Saxon term, and data protection when I talk about the EU. So here they're talking about information, they're talking about an electronic marketplace and also consumers rather than maybe data subjects or individuals. And you can see I've in the Swarm Orange, I've highlighted some values or concepts that are recurring, because in the other 3 principles that I'll look at, or I guess sets of rules or things to strive towards, you can see these notions coming back and recurring. So yeah, notice awareness, choice, consent is always a big one, and Chert just mentioned that. Access participation, you can see the individuals starting to enter into the picture here, and that follows subsequently as well. Integrity, security, that's quite a technical measure, and enforcement and redress. And these principles were actively adopted or definitely influenced the adoption of the OECD, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, guidelines governing the protection of privacy and transporter flow of personal data in 1980. And then in 1981, the Council of Europe, it's called Convention 108, but it's about data protection, and it's still in force today. So they these concepts spread from the US to these kind of regional treaties or guidelines, so not directly influencing one national jurisdiction necessarily, but influencing sources of law or sets of rules that were shared between jurisdictions in one particular region. Then from the FIPS, we moved to the good old GDPR. So yeah, the EU regulatory framework was relatively young. You had the Data Protection Directive, which started applying in 1995, but they were concluding it in the early 90s, they being the European Commission. And yeah, as you probably know, GDPR was proposed in 2012, adopted 2016, started applying 2018. But here are its cornerstone principles as it's outlined in the actual text of the regulation. So they start with lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. And within that, within lawfulness, which was also actually mentioned, is consent as a basis for lawful processing of personal data and also other things like legitimate interest. I mean, there's a bit of a sense that consent is monarch, which may or may not be a good thing, but it seems to be the most readily acceptable basis for lawful processing of personal data. Then you have purpose limitations. So if a processor collects personal data for, well, the purpose needs to be specified and limited. And along with that as well, actually, they're all interlinked. Data minimization. So to achieve that purpose, the controller needs to obtain the minimal amount of personal data to ensure that. Accuracy, so the data must be correct, accurate, relevant, up to date. Storage limitations, a bit like data minimization. So once the personal data is no longer useful for the original purpose for which it was collected, it must be deleted. Integrity and confidentiality, this is about technical and organizational measures to maintain data security. And accountability is about the chain of who has what data and when, and so someone's always accountable or responsible for it. And I added in that 8th one as a principle because the GDPR outlines data subject rights a lot. So here they foreground the individual again, and you have things like the right to erasure or right to be forgotten, right to access, right to request deletion, and right to rectification, for instance. So the individual, and this harks back to what both of you actually before me were saying, the individual has a degree of control over their personal data. So this goes along with the right to data protection being a personality right and giving someone a degree of informational self-control. The GDPR, so those are the substantive parts. In terms of extraterritoriality, it has a lot of explicit and indirect as well influences on third states, so non-EU states. Laws and practices for multiple reasons. So for instance, its territorial scope of application is quite wide. So if there is a business offering goods or services to those in the union, that's how they phrase it, or monitoring the behavior of individuals in the union, no matter whether or not they're established in the EU or have a subsidiary there, they need to adhere to at least some of the aspects of the GDPR for some of the processing purposes. So, you know, you could imagine that a company has very, very little to do with the EU or definitely individuals in the EU, but might be caught by that, it's Article 3, by that specific provision. And there are other sorts of ways. So adequacy requirement, you may only send personal data to a third state if it's got an essentially equivalent degree of data protection as in the EU. So that's kind of a soft law effect of this adequacy standard that has actually been in place for quite a long time. So you can say that the EU is setting a golden standard actively, and it has been fairly successful at influencing the content of most states' data protection laws today. I think there are about 120 with such laws. But why that is, I don't know. Is it for fundamental rights protection, or is it just so they can gain market access, or somewhere along that spectrum? I think it's probably somewhere along there. But this notion of extraterritoriality has successfully influenced some kind of globally shared norm. Then moving away from these kind of hard and fast legal documents, although the FIPS is not legally binding, you have the Fair Data Principles, which is part of what we're explicitly discussing today. And you can find them in the link that Chit put in the chat. Some of the recurring themes, I mean, you can read those yourselves. I won't go into them in the interest of time, but some of the recurring themes are foregrounding the individual in terms of ownership and control over their personal data. Again, consent pops up. And then you can see these kind of normative underpinnings, so social good, and this follows in the next thing that I'm going to show you. But also the notion of ethics by design. You see something similar in the GDPR, including privacy by design and by default, and data protection by design and by default. I think it's interesting that it makes sense with the Fair Data Society that they've gone for the ethics terminology or concept, but the whole set of principles, certainly compared to the FIPS, builds upon them and has perhaps more of a values-based rather than a market or trade-based kind of structure or terminology or narrative. And that said, it builds upon the skeleton of what the FIPS outlined. The principles, to my understanding, are supposed to be unterritorial, so just apply everywhere all the time or online. And there's no kind of limiting clause. So in that sense, they could have a wide sphere of influence. And finally, the EU Data Governance Act proposal. This was a Commission proposal that came out 25th of November of last year. So it's very recent, and it's part of the whole digital services approach of the EU. They've just released that strategy. So some of the terms that you see in it, and it is just the proposal, but they're talking about data sharing services in an open and collaborative manner. Again, giving the individual an overview and control of their data. I just like to add that it's personal data, so related to an identified or identifiable individual, but also non-personal data. So once you start getting big data, machine learning, combining data sets, there's also this concept of data altruism. They have a whole chapter on it, which is basically about the data voluntarily made available by individuals or companies for the common good. So this ties a little bit with the Fair Data Principles, and I thought that was quite interesting to find in an EU regulation. And within that, they want to have this set standard of consent, so a common European data altruism consent form, which could be quite interesting. I haven't seen a draft of it, but however that materializes. This proposal doesn't have a territorial scope in it. It does say that a data sharing service that somehow interacts with the EU needs a representative in the EU in one of the recitals. But I think based on the rhetoric with which the EU's been promoting it, I think they're trying to have a wide sphere of influence as well, setting standards across the globe. So for the end, this is from this slideshow template, but I thought that's actually a great picture to end with when I'm talking about extraterritoriality and unclear lines and some notion of information and data sharing. So thank you, Swarm, for that. I'll pass to my colleague Aditya now, and then we'll have time for lots of questions and answers after his presentation. Thank you.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, I need to share my screen. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ms. Dahl, for that presentation and introduction. So today I'm going to be talking to you about Swarm as data commons. And with that, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the commons and the concept and its evolution. And specifically, I will then talk about the design principles of the commons and how they can give us certain perspectives for how we might design distributed networks going forward, and then make a connection with European data futures, what the European Union has planned for its data economy. So when we talk about the commons, quite simply, it's a resource system that's shared and managed by a community that operates beyond markets and states. I see why I think the lens of the commons can be really useful when we're thinking about Swarm and distributed networks, is because they basically function as commons for storage and bandwidth and possibly data. So I think there are some strong intersections between how we design distributed networks like Swarm and what we think of governance when we think about the commons. So a quick history of the commons. Most people understand the commons from, or remember the commons from, the idea of the tragedy of the commons, which was something Garrett Hardin talked about. And his idea was that any resource that is shared by a community will always fall to over exploitation and pollution and overuse, because people will always pursue their individual self-interest. But this was strongly refuted by the contributions from Eleanor Ostrom, who went on to win the Nobel Prize for her contributions, because she demonstrated thousands of instances where communities had managed resources sustainably and without resorting to assignment of private property rights or centralized control by the government. Um, so that was the original context of the creation, or of the concept of the commons as an analytical tool, um, and a descriptive framework. And then more recently, more people have extended the framework of the commons to more intangible things like imagining knowledge as commons. And that can be something more tangible like libraries, but also digital commons like open source software or Wikipedia, or community networks as infrastructural commons. And what that can also show you is that the commons in the context of digital networks can operate across layers. So that kind of raises the question, that something to think about is, what is Swarm? And that's something that I will come back to. But I think the important thing to understand about the commons as a tool is that it is a way of seeing. The commons is descriptive because it lets you describe instances of commoning, instances of community sharing and managing resources collectively. The commons is expressive because it's a way to normatively assert that a resource should be held in common. So when you say data as commons, you're kind of asserting that data as a resource should be something that should belong to everybody or should be collectively managed. And the commons is constitutive, which means that the language and the vocabulary of the commons can be used to address and design new commons, which is sort of what I'd like to present in today's talk. So one of the key contributions from the literature of the commons is the eight design principles for the commons. So what the scholars from the commons noticed across all of those instances, so it's based on a lot of empirical research done on thousands of instances where communities had managed resources sustainably, ranging from forests and fisheries and farmland. And they noticed that there were 8 principles or 8 broad best practices that were always present in all of those instances of sustainable management. And these are the broad 8 principles. And what I'm going to do today is use those as a form of a way of ordering thinking when we're thinking of governance strategies for digital commons, particularly from the perspectivity of how do you ensure that these institutions continue and sustain themselves and increase their uptake. So the first principle is clearly defined boundaries, and that means a clarity on what the resource is and who should be included or excluded. In constructed commons like digital commons, it's almost automatic because you create them from the ground up. But basically, it forces you to have some clear idea about what is the community and the users and the maintainers in the context of digital commons. And with Swarm, I think it's easy to see the Swarm as a commons for infrastructure in the sense of network and bandwidth. But there's an open question about what happens with the content and the metadata, and whether the lengths of the commons can be extended for distributed governance on that level as well. A very important principle is the rules being congruent to local context, which which means they need to match the resource and the community. And this is where, in the context of Swarm and distributed networks, Ethereum and blockchain are such an important part of the puzzle, because they allow you to align incentives in a way that matches the costs and benefits of participation in the commons for a lot of people. It's important to understand that rules can operate at 3 levels: operational, collective, and constitutional. So the operational rules are the day-to-day rules of how people access a resource. The collective rules are the rules about how those operational rules are created and enforced. And the constitutional rules are the rules about who can participate in the formation of the collective rules. And that's where I think there's a lot of confusion about governance by blockchain and governance of the blockchain, because we can have technological governance through blockchain, but there are elements of institutional governance that are also important and often under analyzed. And so an important provocation there is, can we see open source as an institution for collective choice rules? The next principle is collective choice mechanisms, which basically means people are affected by the rules should have say in their formation. And we're confronted there with the question of who gets to participate in rule formulation and at what levels. And there's a connection here with the Fair Data Society principles of accountability. And that's also connected with the next principle of monitoring mechanism. But there needs to be ways to monitor the state of the resource and rule violations. And the monitors should be part of or accountable to the community. Now, the interesting thing with digital commons is that there is because they're constructed and technologically created, the enforcement is near perfect. The code is law. So our idea of monitoring kind of needs to change. So the questions that we might think about are, what are the metrics for measuring quality of the resource? And I think a very important question to consider is, are there actions or actors that are not limited by the architecture? And whether in those instances, there need to be additional monitoring mechanisms at an institutional level that cannot necessarily be captured at the technical or architectural level. The next principle is graduated sanctions. And it's simply a system of proportionate penalties, and that can range from simply notifying offenders that the violation of a rule has been noticed, to stronger sanctions, and that can range from penalties or all forms of enforcement, depending on the nature of the commons. And again, in the context of digital commons like Swarm, because we have technological enforcement, it's important to consider other actions and actors not limited by architecture, and what sort of graduated sanctions might be useful to bring into place to ensure trust in the system. The next principle is access to low-cost dispute resolutions, which need not be super formal, but need to be simple and accessible. Again, in technological commons, because a lot of the behaviors are mediated through technology, it's important to consider, despite that, what are the disputes that might arise, and between what kinds of parties. And I think a really interesting and important conversation is about access to dispute resolution is the ability to fork. Can we consider that dispute resolution? Because I think that is an interpretation of dispute resolution when it comes to such projects. But I think what's important to consider is that you can fork the project, but you can't fork a community. So when we're talking about dispute resolution, there is a difference between mechanisms that provide voice and mechanisms that provide exit as a form of dispute resolution. Coming to the final principles, this is just the principle of nested governance, which basically means that it encaptures the idea of subsidiarity and decentralization, which I think to a large extent are one of the core principles of Swarm and distributed networks, that that capacities to make decisions, that governance needs to be distributed, quite simply. But I think it also captures the idea and the importance of interoperability, and seeing how a particular commons or a particular network can operate operate harmoniously and appropriately within a larger ecosystem. And I think that's something that we've all sort of addressed in the previous presentations as well, because of how the applications like My Data can interoperate with Swarm. And the final principle is recognition by external authorities, which basically means that for a network to sustain itself, the rule-making authority of that community within itself should have a certain amount of recognition by external authorities. And I think that sort of in the context of networks like Swarm, it confronts us with the question of how do the commons relate to the surrounding legal regime, and how might they interact with things like the GDPR and the data governance proposal. And that, I think, is a good segue to think about the European data futures. And I think a key question underlying this discussion is, to what extent does data sharing require distributed architecture? Because data sharing is a very crucial part and a key part of the European data strategy, because what they want to do is create sectoral data spaces and pools. And I think it's an important question to think about is, what additional affordances does the architecture bring? And some of that is clear from the previous presentations. And there are some earlier examples as well. For example, the European Union's Decode project tried to create data commons based on blockchain technology. And they basically created smart rules that allowed granular dynamic consent. And Mistal's already talked about the data governance proposal, but I think some important provocations there are, can Swarm enable the creation of sharing platforms, or can applications that are built on Swarm create the applications that would be addressed or addressed by the data governance proposal? And how might these applications challenge the data governance proposal's application and enforcement? So yeah, with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy for any comments or questions or criticisms.
Robin, you're muted.
Thanks. Thank you, Church, for letting me know. Mistal and Aditya, those are two fascinating presentations, I have to say, so thank you very much. I learned a lot. I think when we initially got the opportunity to do this research project, I had hopes that the two of you would get involved and be as enthused as I sort of was at the start. And I think those presentations showed that you are. I did have some provocations, but I think it's probably more wise to just open it up to the group, because I think part of this workshop was really getting opinions and perspectives from the Swarm community, because as much as we may have an understanding of what they're trying to build, I think they're going to have the better understanding, and to get those perspectives from them, I think, is also more interesting for our work as we try and kind of bind the two concepts, ideologies, philosophies together, right? So I'll hand it over maybe to Chert or to anybody else in the chat, or anybody that wants to pose a specific question on the presentations, and we can go from there.
So I would, sorry, camera didn't turn on. So I would remind everyone that you can raise your hand somehow, or just write in the chat that you are raising your hand so that you can get a voice to ask or contribute. So do you believe so about this, all these data flows that are happening? So do you believe maybe that this is getting to Swarm somehow, I guess? Do you believe that some kind of global regulation is going to emerge, or maybe that there will be like localized data, like nations organized around different regulation, having their own data pools or something to that effect?
Yeah, I can take that on. Thanks, Chit. I personally think, I don't think there'll be this return to kind of a territorialized internet where the internet's kind of walled off in the way that sovereign jurisdictions are on the ground. I think that the EU's influence will become, and it is becoming, a kind of golden standard also for Swarm, also for various forms of internet governance and data protection law or similar things. So I think it will be this kind of knock-on effect that was originally there for third states to get market access, but has taken on more of a normative dimension or character. And in order to trade with the EU, states have had to kind of phrase their data protection laws in fundamental rights terms and ratchet up their standards. So I think it will be a bit of that soft power. I don't think there's enough globally shared attitudes or laws or even desire. If you've got Russia and China who don't want to conclude such a treaty, then it'll already be difficult. And then you've got, you know, another Western liberal democracy, the US, that's also got such different conceptions that I think legally it would be really hard to find a shared approach and therefore a global treaty that could govern such transactions. So I think ultimately it will be some kind of devolution to the EU standard that would regulate things such as swarm.
So because actually, so I don't want to like dominate here or anything, but okay, so we have a question, but maybe just I'll ask later. Gregor is asking, he commends you on the presentation. One question that comes to mind is the principles are maybe also in any conflict or in opposition with the GDPR and others. Did you maybe encounter that? The Fair Data Society principles, he means.
Okay. Yeah, I think, well, they go far beyond the GDPR. I think GDPR is obviously very legalistic and very technical, and it doesn't have those sort of, you know, social good principles underlying it. I don't know, well, apart from this kind of fundamental rights rhetoric, that it's for different goals. I don't know if any of them contradict maybe these notions of how they view consent and the degree to which it's informed or unambiguous, and having, well, at least in, I've got them, you know, the Fair Data Society principles focus so much on this kind of control and ownership of an individual, whereas GDPR focuses more on the data controller as the owner of that information, and then the individuals can exercise certain rights vis-a-vis that data controller's ownership. So that might be a way they're in conflict, but I haven't thought about it so much. It's interesting. Yeah. I don't know if you had something to add.
Yeah, I had something to add, because when I was listening to both your presentations, and especially yours, Mistal, there was a sense that there's sort of a movement. Well, initially there was a movement towards centering the individual and the individual's rights, and we kind of see that in the GDPR. And then in the Fair Data Principles, we start, and in the EU Data Spaces or the Data Governance Act, we see a movement towards the concept of data altruism or data for the public good. And I just thought that was really interesting in itself. That there was sort of an acknowledgement or a move towards, I mean, I don't want to bring politics into it, but to a more kind of socialist ideal regarding data. And then that links back into what Aditya was talking about with the data commons. I don't know if you had any thoughts of that or anybody else in the Swarm group had thoughts on it, but I thought that was really interesting in itself.
So I would actually try to give voice to Rinke, because he had, maybe he'll comment this, but he also has a question. So Rinke, are you ready to talk? Where are you now?
Yeah, I'm here. Do you
oh,
guys
you're
hear me?
already here. Oh, sorry. You're yeah, okay.
Yeah. So actually, like the question which I answered, which I wrote in the chat, I think it ties into what you just mentioned, Robin, because I think when we're talking about Swarm as a personal data storage, then you can definitely put your data on Swarm and you encrypt it, and it's only accessible to you. But I think like one of the interesting things that I personally find about Swarm is that it kind of like allows a new paradigm, and this paradigm is basically that I'm allowing data, I'm putting data on Swarm, I don't encrypt it, so it's available for everybody. But after I send it to the Swarm network, it is, it belongs to the network, and the network belongs to nobody. So basically this data that then is in the Swarm network, you can kind of see that it is owned by everybody and nobody at the same time. So I think that maybe also ties into this data altruism and like what Aditya was talking about. But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this kind of architecture and whether this is even considered by the EU. Like it's something new that's interests me about Swarm. Thank you.
Can I respond? Yeah, I think that's a great question, because that was one of the provocations that we had that we sent out in our abstract. Is the governance of we called it is the governance of metadata distributed, but the metadata was a loose term for exactly what you're talking about. Basically, all forms of non-personal data that might exist in the Swarm network, and that's, I think, a completely open discussion in the sense I'm not an expert on Swarm. I've tried to become familiar with it, but right now I don't. It's an open question in my head of what happens with that data, and I think that connects with Robin's question as well, because I think the real dichotomy now in ideas of data protection is exactly what you said, by the way. Uh, Ideas of data protection that center completely on individual control, and ideas of data protection that consider more collect or center more on groups or collectives or more democratic formations. Um, so the current European approach, even for example, the data protection, the Decode Data Commons project, and even a lot of platforms like the ones that we've seen today, really ultimately center on individual control of data. But there is now a real sense that maybe we need to move beyond, build an additional layer of governance on it, where there can be more, as you say, social or collective models of data decision making around data. And I think the data altruism model begins to take the first step towards those sort of data futures. But it's really a conversation that's happening as we speak, and that's why you have so much discussion about data unions and data trusts and data cooperatives and data collaboratives. They all often talk about the same things, but to me, I think the real distinction or the real analytical differences might be, where do we focus only on the individual, or do we also have an institutional process for thinking about collective decision making about the data? That was really long, but I hope that made sense.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks for that. Yeah, what I said, I think that that Swarm would be especially suitable and very interesting to analyze Swarm in the aspect of actually like shared data and do that. Like you can definitely make like private data pods on Swarm, but the underlying architecture of Swarm is such that actually we're sharing all the data to the network, and once this data is in the network, it's like, you know, we can hack around and making it only accessible to me, but on the network, like the lowest layer, it is just owned by the network. So that's interesting. Yeah, I would love to talk more about that, but I'll send you an email. Yeah.
You can also use this opportunity, so there's also a question from Gregor. Should there be more commons, like infrastructure commons, data commons, and so on? So I would maybe add my thoughts here, because I have them written down. So I think, if I understood the presentations correctly, so the network itself can be considered a commons, right, according to these principles, but data is a different thing. So, and I think maybe, yeah, this is also what we have been talking just now with Rinke. It's some of the data is like public, and some of it is private, and I guess, yeah, it is different, right? The public data, I guess it's commons or what, and the private one, it depends on how you use it. Or
yeah, I think, yeah, the network itself can be seen as a commons. And when you say the data and the data commons on Swarm is a whole other thing. Like it can be, it's a completely, it's its own conversation, and that's partly what like Rinke also addressed, because it's a completely different set of questions when you're thinking about just the data. And the 8 design principles that I talked about, you would think of them in slightly different ways when you're thinking about data. And for example, one of the complications will always be, what is personal data? Because then you have to come back to, then you don't just have the concept of the commons, but you also have to align it with data protection principles. So I think the analogy would be, if you think of Wikipedia is a commons at the layer of content. but it's not a commons at the layer of its infrastructure. And the discussion that we've had, and Swarm can be more easily seen as a commons at the, like closer to the way Wikipedia is not a commons, which is to say at the closer to the infrastructural level, but not at the not automatic. It's not automatically a commons at the content level in terms of what we do with the data. So the commons, and that's the principle of nested governance as well, that the commons can operate at multiple levels, and it's an open question about how we make that happen.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there because you mentioned governance, and I think that's really, really interesting to talk about from the context of Swarm, because we have this idea of maybe an architectural commons, and then we have the idea of the data commons. But ultimately, it needs to be governed by the community or by the network, and there needs to be some processes in place that go beyond just the algorithmic processes for governments. Whether that's a consensus mechanism or whether it's a code repository, there is a human layer, and I think that those questions surrounding governance and nested governance, which you mentioned, are also really interesting. So maybe that's something we can throw back to members of Swarm, how they imagine the governance manifesting as this moves forward, or how has it maybe manifested, up to this point, and will it have to change when Swarm gets deployed in a real live setting?
So I would pass the governance to someone else. The governance question.
Hi. Yeah, maybe I can address it. I would say we actually try to address this at the multiple levels. So each of these levels is at a different point. As you said, if we speak strictly about the Swarm network of nodes pushing chunks back and forth, so to speak, the infrastructure, this has been already well defined through our incentives, through the incentives design. We are aware that there's also the aspect of basically addressing the data commons, that this more defines like the direction into which the ecosystem on top of Swarm is developing. And for this is we are very early on. This is why we are here today, and your presentations are very valuable actually also for this part. And then, of course, to figure out long-term how the network infrastructure and the data aspect, how they work together, and how they can operate independently of any entity. So yeah, so we should be over time go deeper into the rabbit hole of decentralization. Yeah.
So I would actually squeeze in a question here, so we can of course extend this to 5 past since we started late. There are also other questions. I would give maybe the voice later on to the person asking. Sorry. But so we're talking about commons a lot, right? It's like we imagine what this is, but as I was a while back reading about commons, and then all these things surfaced, Aditya, that you mentioned, like trusts and collaboratives, and I don't know, like 7 or 10 different terms that are used frequently, and I don't know how many more that are used less frequently. And then you sort of get confused and so on. So what is it exactly that we're talking about, the commons? I guess it is not like a legal thing. It's more like is a commons something that is legally recognized, at least throughout the EU? Like this is governed as a commons, so legally this should be perceived as this and this thing. And also maybe if I squeeze in the EU data spaces in here. So if I participate in a EU data space, sharing data with other people, can I have a commons? Is that enough, or do I have to have if this is a legal thing, or do I have to have like a trust or a collaborative or cooperative? Or
yeah, so this is basically the core of what my current research focus is, because there is so much discussion about data trusts and data commons and data cooperatives, but it is very difficult to come up with any clear sort of analytical or conceptual distinctions between these models. They all really draw from each other. It's not always the description of how they're supposed to operate is there are strong overlaps in all of them. So I think some of the differences that I can sort of point to are they all sort of come from slightly different traditions. So when you're talking about data commons, they draw from, as I said, this very rich history of people managing resources in a way that everybody has access to it in some way. When you're talking about data trusts, they're trying to build on top of more legal concepts, like the idea, like trusts as a concept, and fiduciary duties, where you appoint someone as or you appoint an entity or a person uh, with power to take decisions on your behalf. And the idea is that the data trust can negotiate with like bigger platforms and negotiate that trust. So for example, in the presentation we saw from MidHub, the idea is not that you have the app. The difference with some of the ways people talk about data trusts is that instead of the app where you're constantly having to monitor and self-manage your privacy, you've sort of appointed someone that you trust, and they are negotiating with entities, not only from a perspective of data protection, but also from into also more positive ways of using data. So giving your health data away for COVID research, like the data altruism model is sort of based on that idea. And then if you have data unions and data cooperatives, they are trying to build from the traditions of these communities, like unions and cooperatives, and people coming together from existing communities and having stronger bargaining rights and a stronger bargaining position against larger platforms. So that is that is one way to look at the differences that they're trying to build from different principles. But in real terms, there's a strong overlap. I recently went to this discussion where the people that are strongly piloting the idea of data trusts were talking about how maybe we should look at how we should look at commons principles to actually operationalize how we really do data trusts. So it's everybody still kind of trying to tease out the analytical and conceptual differences. To my mind, I think one clear way to maybe look at it is what I mentioned earlier. Where does where does the locus of decision making happen? Are you constantly managing your privacy and accepting cookies or not? Or have you given that away to a trusted entity? That I think can be one way to that to me is one clear two different models. But then and that has its own sort of issues about how do you operationalize that trust or that democratic control over data. But yeah, it's a little all over the place, that's for sure.
Thank you. So, Heterotic, would you like to ask so via voice? Should I can click here, allow to talk. Let me try. Will you? Hello?
Hi.
Hi.
So my question was, does metadata on the swarm not default to a commons, in the sense that since it's a permissionless network, you can collect this information if you have the capacity to do so, to whatever degree you focus on it, and can derive, products from that data freely, right? Is that not just a commons then?
Can I just jump in quickly? I think this is one of the hard questions. I think, and it's difficult from a number of perspectives, philosophical, ideological, but also legal, because metadata in itself does not necessarily mean it's not personal data in the eyes of the law, and this has sort of been at least been part of guidelines drawn down by the European Data Protection Supervisor with respect to the metadata that is generated in piloted vehicles or autonomous vehicles. So I don't know. I mean, Mistal, you're the legal expert here. I mean, metadata is an area which is very complex, at least from my understanding of it, and it's very murky waters. And I think it would be hard to fall on either side of the fence with any conviction from my perspective. But I don't know, Mistal, maybe you could expand on your view of this.
Well, if we're just looking at the regulatory framework as it pertains to the personal data, then it, you know, prima facie wouldn't fall into that. But once you combine metadata sets and find suddenly that certain individuals are identifiable, then that kind of legal protection comes into action. But yeah, it's a really murky area and difficult to answer with legal clarity, for sure.
Okay, so there's actually something that's on my mind also. So Swarm has this peer-to-peer infrastructure. So the benefits of it are that so nobody is actually in control, right? I mean, nobody can take it down. If there's data on there, nobody can censor it or shut it down. So do you maybe see with all this, well, in the economic sense and in the legal sense, benefits and problems. So would nations opt for this kind of thing as like if there's some cooperation between multiple nations, like there will be perhaps in data spaces, although that might not be the best case, but so nobody can like take away that data, nobody can censor it, or maybe there are also some difficulties with this problem. So would the European Union say, oh no, this is too complicated to use, there's all sorts of legal issues and so on?
Yeah, I think they might well say that, because suddenly you throw into question like any sense of clarity, predictability, but also chains of responsibility and accountability, which are quite cornerstone principles for, you know, not just data protection law, but you mentioning kind of freedom of expression, those sorts of things. So I think definitely it would be a legal and probably policy minefield as well. Therefore, very difficult. I mean, you also see just if you're dealing with things with no central authority in a like public or permissionless blockchain, and almost anyone can theoretically add personal data to it. Who's the data controller? Who's the data processor? Is it, you could interpret it as a user who enters the personal data as the data controller, and anyone who has a copy as the data processor, but it's just not, it's just very difficult to regulate. So in that sense, to your original question, I think it would be very difficult for the EU to do so, and maybe a little political. But I'm curious what everyone else thinks.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think that was the original sort of seduction of like distributed networks, that you would create these permissionless platforms that states can't directly regulate. So I think on some level they are sort of clearly antithetical, and that's something governments will always struggle with unless they can co-opt it in the way that, for example, now blockchain is something that is just an efficient data storage way for big companies and governments to operate. But I think, and this is connected to what Mistal also said, that, and to also answer your question, I think the question of business models and incentives is always going to be a problem in terms of uptake, because, for example, if so much of the business model is based on the analysis of personal data, if you're taking away big chunks of it, then there is an open question about how you're going to scale, basically, to make these the dominant way of how we design things online. And even if you take away control from the government, I don't think you can run away from questions of governance. So questions of data protection still exist, and accountability still exist, and questions of content also still exist. I mean, the big boogeyman on the internet is for content regulation is child sexual abuse material. And so, I mean, if I could use that as an example, networks that cannot be inherently surveilled or censored have to address the possibility that they can be used for that material. And you can be okay with that from the point of your libertarian ethic, but that's still a question that needs to be considered when you're talking about from the point of view of governance, because then that is just not good or ethical design. So just to say that it is antithetical to governments, but it's not antithetical to governance.
There was a great comment. I don't know, heterotic. I don't know if you want to jump in and give your view on this, because I actually think this is a really interesting perspective that maybe we could talk about for the kind of
What I just really want to recognize what Aditya just said, right? I mean, it really does come back to this idea that governance and governments aren't necessarily the same thing. But this is an important responsibility of the designers of systems. And so it bears deep reflection in the BZZ, in the Swarm community here for sure. I mean, to a certain degree, there's anonymity, but organizations that are large enough to track interactions across nodes, especially with regards to some of the tools that we've discussed so far this week, really exposes, and what I see it is a security, you know, OPSEC. It's a security issue if these endpoints expose the network to the powers that be, in fact, because there are lives, you know, being forced right now.
I mean, just from my perspective, I suppose it depends on who you think the powers that be are, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the governments. It could also be the big tech companies who have kind of proven to be most harmful to our own, well, dignity and privacy, right? I do think that there's still a really interesting question regarding, and I know Aditya, you touched on this, so maybe you could provide some input around accountability. And you mentioned something about technologically enforced accountability, which is maybe really difficult to achieve on a permissionless network. I.e., if there is a violator who you know, you have removed consent for use of the personal data and they continue to use it, how are they held accountable at the network layer? And that is something I think that would have to a bridge that would have to be crossed by Swarm at some stage. Because I think it's a really interesting topic. I don't know, Aditya, if you had any more thoughts on that.
I think that's connected to what Heterotic just pointed out, that distributed architecture doesn't fix privacy, it changes the threat model. So what you might not have to worry about centralized surveillance, but in a way, what you might then have to worry about is vulnerable peers or malicious peers in the network. And then, yeah, when we're talking about the network, these networks like these, because so much of the enforcement is technological, this is basically, I think, new ground. We're so used to more like human-based and institutional sort of frameworks of accountability and governance. In some ways, this was the shiny new thing, right? You could use blockchain to align incentives. You could use you could do away with like sort of human issues with this and code the trust. Yeah, you don't have to trust the institution. You could just code the trust into the code. But that also means that yeah, you have to come up with novel ways of addressing the questions that you just talked about. Which is, like I said, it's novel, and it's something that we begin to examine now when we create networks like these.
So maybe just this one more comment, and then we go to the MAA since we're out of time. So Gregor, I don't know, Gregor, do you want to speak this, or should I read it, your comment? So Gregor says that the GDPR and similar should be addressed on layer 2, where data subject to GDPR is shared and stored in appropriate way, essentially a subset of Swarm. and the metadata, especially linked to personal data, can be reduced, eliminated with some kind of chunks, right? So this puts more focus also on education of the users. So, and Mistal, I think you maybe would want to comment on this, or you found it interesting?
Yeah, I just found it an interesting idea. Maybe it's like a kind of more practical solution that can have something kind of tangible and useful come out of it. I hadn't thought about it before.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we can conclude now with the workshop. So thank you for this, but please stay on for maybe any more general questions at the AMA, and I would like all the presenters to would ask all the presenters to turn on the cameras, and maybe if there are any more questions for either Alexander, Salman, or Mr. Aditya or Robin. Hello. So I guess we did have a lot of discussion during the actual presentations or after the presentations. So I would like to thank you all for participating. It was a very interesting interesting presentations and interesting discussion. I think we gained a lot of insights, so thank you for that. I guess maybe you should also, if you want to post your contact details into the chat or somewhere if you haven't already. And thank you also to the attendees. I would remind you again that tomorrow, although Saturday, is also a day with a program, actually a bit more program than usually. So it starts at 14:30 Central European time, and I think the titles of the presentations are already available. If they are not, they will be shared with you, I guess, via email also if you're one of the attendees. So I don't know if maybe somebody would last call, otherwise it's Friday, so yeah. Have a good weekend, and thank you all. Yes, again, stay healthy.
Thank you so much, all. Really, really nice session.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Chert.
Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Salman. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.